Professor Howard Williams takes you on a journey through time and space, exploring death and memory, past and present. Archaeodeath.
On this Archaeodeath YouTube channel, I've been reviewing some of my own back publications, some of my academic work that has got to print from 1997 up to recent times, particularly so far focusing on edited collections, trying to explain something of the background, rationale, contents, and then some of the takeaway significances of the book in the present climate where I can evaluate them. Now, I want to break from that in this video to give a little bit of an introduction to a book by other people, and the reason I want to do that is because I have a chapter in it, and also because in the current climate, and related to my other recent video on Anglo-Saxon archaeology, it's quite clear that many of the commentators who have been trying to comment on and evaluate early medieval archaeology in southern and eastern Britain, what we call the Anglo-Saxon period from the 5th to 11th centuries, looking at the connections and complexities of the centuries from the end of Roman Britain up to the Norman conquest, that traditional bracketing of those 7 centuries or thereabouts. Many of those who've been commenting don't really seem to have a clear inkling into anything that's been going on in early medieval archaeology in southern eastern Britain in the last 40 to 50 years. And so while I may be a bit patronising to some of them, but I think I'll hopefully be helpful for a lot of readers if I introduce you to this book. This is the Oxford Handbook of Anglo-Saxon Archaeology, edited by Helena Hamerow, David Hinton and Sally Crawford. Now, this book is almost 1,100 pages long. 52 chapters are contained within it, and this book is perhaps the first one that does it in a state-of-the-art, fully expansive and comprehensive sense. Now, it retails in hardback at over £110, but given the fact it's available softbound at £35, that's way under £1 per chapter. That's relatively very, very good value for high quality academic publications, and so 35 quid's a lot of money, but actually, given the context, this is actually quite good. Now, I'm not trying to sell it to you, but I would say if you have a library access or you want to learn about Anglo-Saxon archaeology, it remains the best single volume on the market. So it's not exactly a textbook because it's pretty detailed, but it is a really in-depth, rigorous overview of 52 themes within the archaeology of the 5th to 11th centuries AD, written mainly by archaeologists, but some historians, anthropologists, literary scholars and others contribute to this book. And it really does sort of need digesting and evaluating before perhaps reflecting on issues about the future of the discipline. Now, the contents of this book are quite wide-ranging and are worthy of brief, explanation. There's a part 1 is Anglo-Saxon identity, ethnicity, culture and genes, and there's 7 chapters here with an overview by Catherine Hills, and then a sort of chronological run-through from the 5th to the 11th century, from the ending of Roman Britain right the way up to the sort of the end of Anglo-Saxon England, and then papers on migration and molecular evidence and dress and identity. That is the kind of overview for some of the big complex questions of who were the Anglo-Saxons and what does their identity mean to them and to us. And then we have a second section, part 2, on rural settlement, which really is one of those important sections with an overview by Helena Hamerow, and then 4 further syntheses looking at the timber-framed buildings, really, timber buildings and the settlement hierarchy, churches in the countryside and later Saxon settlements, sort of giving you that evidence of how people lived. That's a really important section. And then we have a part 3, which is on mortuary ritual, where a lot of our evidence has traditionally come from. And there's an overview by Tanya Dickinson, a chapter by the late Martin Welsh on the Middle Anglo-Saxon final phase, and then Dawn Hadley reviews the later burial practice, but I had the honour of doing the 5th, 6th and early 7th century evidence, mortuary practices in early Anglo-Saxon England. So I'm very pleased and proud to have been able to contribute to that section of this big book. Although burial evidence comes back into many subsequent discussions, because a lot of our evidence comes from graves, and some of the thematic chapters pick up on that. Part 4 is on food production, with an overview of woods and the wild, animal husbandry, food and plants, and Anglo-Saxon fields. Then we have a craft production and technology as part 5, looking at raw materials, crafts and style and art. And we have part 6 on trade, exchange and urbanisation, looking at the fate of Roman towns, interactions between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons, looking at markets, emporia and wicks, coinage, and burrs and boroughs. So taking you through the evidence of trade, exchange and urbanisation. Part 7, very interesting, and lots of the burial evidence come back in here, is on the body and the life course, an overview by Sally Crawford, and then chapters looking at different aspects of identity and disease. Really good section. And then personal favourite again of mine, part 8, the archaeology of religion, with an overview by John Blair, and then a range of interesting papers on pre-Christian and then Christian religious practice and material cultures, sacred places and spaces. Part 9, Signals of Power, with an overview by Martin Carver, has lots of burial evidence in there too, with an interesting chapter by Chris Scull, Marek Gamester on images and power, so art comes back in there, and Andrew Reynolds on crime and punishment, and then intellectual territories by Martin Carver, and a final section, which is perhaps the most interesting but also the most frustrating, I must say, an attempt to look at the place of archaeology in Anglo-Saxon studies. This is perhaps a mixture of very dated and very half-baked stuff in this, from historical sources, literary sources, place names, anthropological interactions with Anglo-Saxon archaeology, and I think perhaps the most important chapter of the entire book, Anglo-Saxon Archaeology and the Public by Sonia Marzinzik. Now, I've only just read out titles there, but I think that gives you an impression of the scale and scope of this book. I must say, though, that even though it has a full 52 chapters, it does have a lot that's missing. And I would have liked to have seen a lot more in here. And I think if I was editor, or if there was a new version of it in a few years, one could add new information, new discoveries, new analyses, and there's a whole series of new areas that perhaps are touched on in chapters here but could be drawn on and evaluated further, such as assembly sites, a lot of the evidence of the portable antiquity schemes, so small find evidence of the distribution. It's in here, but there's more that could be said on that, for example. Fresh work on new graves, new settlement sites, and new interactions between disciplines, and there's more to be said about the broader theoretical context. But there are some sad lacking bits. They come out in places, but I really think some of the lacunae in this book are interesting. There's stone sculpture comes out in about 4 or 5 chapters, very briefly, but the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture, a Durham University-run project, doesn't really get represented in this volume. And while we know, and indeed many of the arts, Leslie Webster has a chapter on the arts, and she soon after this brought out her own book on Anglo-Saxon art, as did other people. But I think the lack of visual evidence here is here in Marek Gamester's chapter, Leslie Webster's chapter, and appears throughout, but particularly the stone sculpture doesn't get detailed attention. Perhaps the biggest yawning gap for me, given that I edit the Offers Dyke Journal, is linear earthworks. And while there are problems around their dating, in the last 15 to 20 years, really, it is no excuse. The linear earthworks should have been a focus of discussion in sections about power, about territorial and landscape organisation, and in terms of interactions and exchanges, land travel, maritime communications. Seafaring is another, actually, that leads me on to linear earthworks is one omission. Seafaring and coastal archaeology as a maritime archaeology is really not represented in this book. This is very much of a landlubber volume in many ways. And indeed, Celtic interactions, if I can call it that, Ireland and Western and Northern Britain, there's only one chapter that dedicates itself to looking beyond Anglo-Saxon England. It's quite a landlocked, but also quite insular book in that regard. and it's a pity there isn't an Anglo-Saxon or an Oxford Handbook of early medieval Britain that allows more chapters to talk about northern and western Britain in the same centuries as southern and eastern Britain. Continental connections are noted throughout, but again, they're underrepresented in thinking about the issues of migration and trade and exchange, the church, and so on. I think that's one of the areas that's a little frustrating. The Anthropology and Archaeology chapter by Chris Gosden. I like Chris a lot, and he does some really great and insightful things, but that really is a really frustrating chapter. It doesn't take off, and there's many more. I mean, it does try to bite off a big topic, but there's a lot more that could have been done with looking at the synergies and connections between anthropology and archaeology, as well as the relationships between archaeology and the other disciplines. History of archaeology is absent. Tanya Dickinson tackles it a bit in the introduction to the burial section, but there's no real grounding and introduction to the historiography from the 16th and 17th centuries, the 18th and 19th centuries, and the 20th and 21st centuries. And if I was going to level criticism at, which is actually allowed the field to be the focus of so much criticism, I think you can see that the lack of attention to the theoretical baggage and problems of past research the discipline has collectively set itself up for criticism by lacking that theoretical frameworks and historiographical underpinnings, critiquing, for example, the racial and culture historic models that so long were the mainstay of the study, as well as religious perspectives. And one other area I think is really disappointing is the lack of a broader engagement of Anglo-Saxon archaeology with politics and popular culture, the way that Anglo-Saxon archaeology is being exploited and used. Now, Sonia's chapter, I said, was very important because it does look at the educational, museological heritage values and significances of Anglo-Saxon sites, and Bede's World, now Jarrow Hall, Sutton Hoo, Westow, and British Museum, and so on. But that broader relationship of Anglo-Saxon archaeology to British society, or the peoples of these islands today, but also globally, is not really present in this book. And so again, that sets us up for perhaps some of the criticisms that have been levelled at the subject area. So this is reflecting in 2011 a robust, sophisticated, varied and really rich field of investigation with complex theoretical ideas, synergies with other disciplines, new discoveries and new methods and techniques being deployed. A real up-to-date, modern, burgeoning field of study. And yet equally within it are some of the seeds of modern disputes and debates. And while I don't expect everyone watching this video to have been aware of what I'm alluding to here, that some of the accusations of Anglo-Saxon studies and particularly history and literary scholars, but archaeology is implicated in it, as still working with racial models, some of the still working in an outmoded way. A superficial glance at this book could give you justification for thinking that's true. I think a more detailed reading of it will make it very clear that that's not the case. But I'm just saying, perhaps collectively we could have done better to flag up some of the challenges and problems, and some of the absences from the book I think are revealing about the absences set us up for problems in contending with and tackling these issues. So it's hardly a book review, and sorry to Sally and Helena and David for attempting it in a video. It's not a very done thing to do with archaeological work, but I am actually promoting it as the last big thing 9 years on that you can read, that gives you an introduction to the rich and fascinating archaeology of the centuries in Britain from the 5th to the 11th centuries. And while there's gaps, and I think there are some more than gaps, there's some real sort of omissions, or there's some really good chapters in here that give you the basis to follow up and do further research on the period and learn a lot more about these exciting centuries and the peoples that migrated, inhabited, transformed the landscape, and were transformed by that landscape during this period. So often mischaracterized as a dark age, so often misunderstood. And I think also in the disciplines that study these centuries, still archaeology is underrated and seemingly ignored from some of the key discussions. And why I've come out so passionately in favour of maintaining the phrase Anglo-Saxon archaeology and Anglo-Saxon England is not because I'm wedded to the idea and the baggage that comes with it, but because it is such a rich and varied field of study that's worthy of learning about, and as a sort of platform for further understanding of the complex and rich societies that are under investigation.
Follow Archaeodeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.